I'm Beth Pariseau, Senior News Writer at Informa Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 3, Observability in the Age of AI. Nancy Gohring is a Senior Research Director at IDC, focused on big picture trends related to enterprise AI adoption, including business, organizational, and technology architecture transformation in the context of AI. Previously, her focus as an analyst at both IDC and 451 Research was on the observability and AI ops markets. She has also worked as a science writer and journalist, serving as editor-in-chief of Fierce Market's enterprise IT newsletters, as well as a freelance reporter with bylines in the New York Times, the Seattle Times, Wired, the Dallas Morning News, Macworld, PC World, and The Economist, among others. Thanks for being with us, Nancy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, in a recent IDC report, you covered GenAI operations, which is a term I haven't heard. Is that similar to LLM ops or different?
So what I was trying to do there, and I don't know that other people are using that term, but it's such an interesting period, I think, in adoption of AI and the evolution of GenAI, where language is strange. People are using similar words to mean very different things. So what I was trying to focus on in that report is how you operate a GenAI application as an enterprise once it's in production. Just talking about all the different facets and layers of operations, predominantly from a monitoring perspective, but once you get into production. So LLM ops and ML ops are much broader. So like an ML ops platform is the entire life cycle of building a machine learning model, training it, tuning it, building an application around it, testing it, deploying it, and then operating it. And so that was the distinction that I was trying to make, is that I was just trying to focus on the operations piece. So what you do, because that's a big question that I'm hearing a lot of organizations talk about. They don't really know, once we get this thing in production, what do we have to think about?
Yes.
And there's a lot to think about. That's very different than a traditional non-Gen AI application.
Right. And your report also focuses on some of the organizational changes that come with that, not just technical. So what are some of those changes, and what are people encountering as challenges?
The thing that is interesting is that there's different roles and different personas involved once you start talking about a Gen AI application as compared to an application that doesn't have Gen AI or AI in it. So you have data scientists, potentially you have AI engineers, and then you also probably have sort of traditional developers. And so when it comes to operations, who does what, right? Does your typical operations staff, are they responsible for all facets of performance of a Gen AI application? In most cases, the data scientists or AI engineers are involved, particularly when you're talking about the model. And particularly when you're talking about model performance when it comes to things like quality and accuracy and hallucination, stuff like that, versus traditional application operational concepts like latency and error rates and stuff like that. So I'm not yet seeing best practices set in stone. I am seeing new sets of tools emerge that are oriented specifically around the model performance from the quality perspective versus that operational or system performance perspective. And those tools are more often than not targeted at a data scientist or an AI engineer, but not necessarily. So I'm hearing a lot of discussion out there about who the right personas are. So those are some things that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about organizational changes. Like, should these people be on the same teams? Who's responsible for what? Who's responsible for securing the model? Making sure that there's not security issues around the model. Who's responsible for governance topics?
Right.
Who's responsible for FinOps, looking at cost at a very granular level. So I think there's a lot to think about there, and it's kind of a moving target right now. I'm not really seeing best practices that are very enshrined. I think people are playing around with it, and lots of organizations are doing very different things.
Yeah, I heard at SRECon some really interesting discussions about not just Gen AI, but also machine learning apps in production. And then it does sometimes fall to the SRE when there might be a data feed that stopped shipping and nobody knew it, but then it alters the results of what the model's spitting out to customers through an app. And a lot of times it ends up falling to the SRE to obviously repair that, but to be aware of that early enough that it doesn't just skew the whole model. So the notion of application performance is changing really fast.
It is. And then the other persona that sometimes gets involved, because to your point, like sometimes you don't know that the output is sort of drifting, so to speak, but like a product manager might recognize that, not necessarily someone on the technology side of the house. So that's like another persona that gets involved and might be using some of these tools and looking at some of this data and noticing that the model is drifting a bit. You could have drift because of a scenario like you just described, right? Like a data pipeline sort of breaks and that causes the model to skew its output. Yeah, so lots of new personas, lots of implications for how people approach operations.
Right. There's also the citizen developer aspect with especially agents and LLMs, where you're dealing with a non-technical application developer, which is another wrinkle.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So I've talked with other guests about the tools that are coming into play here. They're obviously as widespread right now as all the different facets of monitoring you mentioned. And some of those things have yet to be created, right? Things like model drift detection, or they're still in development. Do you think it makes sense for all of these personas to come together in a tool? Is that where we might find some harmonization?
So I see a lot of different things happening right now. I also think that we can take a cue from looking at the last 5 or 8 years of the observability market, right? There was a period of time where you had standalone APM tools, you had standalone logging tools, you had standalone network NPM tools. And now you see these observability vendors that offer all of that. Tracing, when tracing first came out, those were standalone tools, right? You had Kubernetes monitoring, that was a standalone tool, right? And then there tends to be consolidation, but it's not identical, right? You see some observability vendors that now have security offerings, right? But not everybody does. So there's going to be some blurring of the edges, and I think right now, this question of personas is having a bearing on how the vendors are thinking about that. But ultimately, I don't think that the persona question should necessarily guide that, because to the points I was just making, if you have an observability tool that includes NPM and APM and infrastructure monitoring, sometimes those are very different personas that are going to be using those different aspects. Could be value in combining them, but you still have lots of different personas coming together using different capabilities of this broader tool. So we might have something like that emerge. What I'm seeing right now are some interesting possibilities. So one is the evaluation technology tools that are being used to evaluate GenAI applications before they push to production. There's a very logical connection between how you run those evaluations in a pre-production world and how you monitor in production. And that becomes this continuous cycle where in many cases you want to capture outputs in production and add them to the data sets that you use to run evaluations. So when you go back and you tweak your application and you want to test it to make sure that that tweak didn't break things, you have these data sets that include questions and answers that to some degree you maybe wanted to capture from production environments, because maybe in production there was a bad output. It was a hallucination. You want to make sure the tweak that you made fixed that, right? So there's a very lot, and that tends to be very often like a data scientist or an AI engineer is doing that kind of work.
Yeah.
Makes sense for that to be in one tool. I mean, that's not happening 100% across the board, but I think it's very logical, and it is happening by some tool vendors. And then it could make sense for those to be incorporated into observability tools. But I think that there's going to continue to be this differentiation in observability between model monitoring and kind of the more traditional monitoring around, again, latency and all that kind of jazz. So yeah. And then to your point, security, I'm seeing some vendors that have evaluation technologies and security and not production observability or monitoring, which is interesting. You see governance. And I think the reason for this is all obvious, right? You're monitoring what's going on in production. It's potentially a shared data set that has different use cases. You're collecting it and analyzing it for different reasons used by different people, but it could be a common data set. So
Yeah, I've talked with some open telemetry experts here this season too about having that common terminology, common layer for data collection, and then having that accessed by multiple tools. So that could be a common ground, maybe.
yeah, for sure. And I know that I haven't looked at it super closely, but I think that there's a working group at Open Telemetry that's trying to extend the standard, particularly around agentic and agentic workflows. So
Yes.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah, I think an interesting development.
Right. Since you mentioned agentic, there's that other whole can of worms.
Yeah,
I think, even 6 months ago, nobody was talking about that. And now it's all anybody's talking about. So,
yeah,
how does that further change this equation or complicate this picture in your view?
quite a lot. And the thing that I think is really interesting when you're talking about getting visibility into agentic collaboration and workflows is the logical next step, which is what you can automate and control once you have that insight.
Mm-hmm.
So let me peel back this onion. One is right now, I'm hearing a lot of enterprises are being slowed down by concerns about lack of insight into an agentic workflow or collaboration once it's in the wild. So
Mm-hmm.
they're like, hey, is this agent going to keep working and working and hitting LLMs like a million times? Then I'm going to get this insane bill for something that's kind of a stupid task that I did not mean to spend that amount of money on, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have the insight, you can't automate or put controls around that, right? So
Yep.
I think collecting that insight is super, super crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And then your mind starts going in really interesting directions, I think. So I've heard people talk about this. I don't think we're anywhere near this, but I think it's really interesting to think about. So once you start collecting that information about what the agent is doing and can do, you start thinking about a lot of really interesting scenarios. So what if, Beth, you're considered a super senior person in your organization, and so your IT department has controls that says anything Beth asks our internal Gen AI system to do, let it do, because her work is so super important. It doesn't matter what it costs. Or it could even be more granular. If Beth is asking to do some HR work, route it to this cheaper LLM and restrict the number of agent turns to X, because that is not a high value request.
Mm.
If Beth is doing competitive intelligence research, that's really high value. Let's go to this smarter model that might cost more because it has higher reasoning capabilities or whatever and can access different kinds of tools, and let it run a little longer because this is high value and really important. And we're okay with it costing more. That's what people are starting to think about. And you can't do any of that unless you've instrumented this process and you can collect the data and get the insight. So it's a first step that I think enables all this knock-on stuff that gets really interesting.
Right. Speaking of how far along we are, I mean, how far along is Gen AI operations in enterprises in production? Not agentic, but just LLM based Gen AI tools.
I mean, my sense is pretty rudimentary,
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that, I think it's going to run the gamut. But I think your general middle of the road enterprise that has done some basic adoption of Gen AI via enterprise applications that now have Gen AI capabilities built in, they're probably doing very little, right? Now, if you look at an enterprise that has some sort of more customized Gen AI application, they're probably doing some level, but I think there's a big spectrum of what level. So they might just be using the observability tools that they're already using, which in many cases, you're not getting the depth of insight into what the model is doing as compared to some of these tools that are very specialized to offering performance insight about the model itself. So I think a lot depends on how much experience the organization has and also the application itself, the Gen AI application itself, because obviously high value, high risk applications, I think people are a little bit more interested in doing the monitoring and the observability. But I think there is so much education that needs to happen. There's just a lack of experience. This is new for everyone.
Yeah.
So I think I don't have data to back up what I'm saying, but my sense as I'm
Anecdotally.
talking to people is, anecdotally, it's not super widespread.
Yeah. Nobody wants to be the guinea pig.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And yet the hype has been so all encompassing. But I just wonder ultimately how all this shakes out. Like, are robots coming for our jobs, or is this going to end up being a bubble? Like, somewhere in between, probably. But I just wonder how things will look in another year. Is this agent thing going to actually work? Was one of my
Yeah.
big questions.
I mean, that it's funny that you say that because you also a couple minutes ago noted that 6 months ago we didn't have agents. So I can't even imagine what's going to happen in a year. I have no idea.
Oh my
Right?
goodness.
I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
Agents, it felt like came out
Yeah.
of the blue. It felt like Gen AI came out of the blue. I know Gen AI has been around, but like Open AI, like that just took the world by storm. So who
Hmm.
knows what's coming next? So I think right now there needs to be a lot of technology advancements in order for us to achieve the vision of agentic AI. I
Hmm.
don't think we're there yet. I think we're on the path to those technology advancements that are going to allow it, but there's a lot of open questions, and I think there's a lot that's going to have to be done. There's a whole bunch of work on various kinds of protocols that will allow agents to talk to each other regardless of where they were built. There's a lot of activity going on there, and that's really important stuff. It's not just at the communication layer, but there's going to have to be security and other kinds of controls around those agentic collaborations. And I think we're pretty early days.
Hmm.
And so those are just, I think it feels like as the days go on, we discover new things that we're going to have to do
Yeah.
to allow this kind of agentic collaboration that allows us to achieve this kind of vision. I don't think that means it's not going to happen. I think it means it's going to be complex, at least in the short term. But then you start hearing, about some sort of interesting experimental model that someone has built that eliminates the requirement for a lot of these frameworks and stuff.
Hmm.
So we might have technology advancements that allow us to leapfrog over this work that we currently have to do to support agent collaboration.
Hmm.
So I don't really know, I don't think anybody knows, but I think that I think this agentic thing is going to happen. It's just a
Yeah.
matter of time and figuring out how to manage it in a way that is secure in the enterprise and that allows enterprises to control cost, and that I think it's going to have an impact. I think what that impact looks like is another question of what enterprises do with that, right?
Hmm.
Someone said something funny the other day about the dogs win. Like if all of your employees gain, say, 20% time back, do the dogs win, meaning everybody just goes home and walks their dogs?
Huh.
Or because it becomes an organizational issue, like not issue, but challenge and problem. If I have 20% more time, what do I do with that time? It's not necessarily built into the existing structure and job descriptions. So
Hmm.
that's requires some work, transformative work on a business level in the enterprise to actually benefit from that extra time.
Right. And organizationally, how do you even maintain sanity with all of these things changing fundamentally so quickly? How do you even decide on a strategy with everything still up in the air?
We are seeing a lot of organizations have like an AI center of excellence, which I know sometimes I feel like there was a period of time where people kind of poo pooed the center of excellence idea, but
Hmm.
I'm finding that they can be pretty useful right now because of exactly what you just said. Things are moving so quickly. And if you architect it right and you have the right people in that center of excellence, I think that's how you do it, right? You get a bunch of different people responsible for different things in the business and they get together
Hmm.
and they're aware of different things that are moving in the market that could be notable to the strategy that you have, and you continually shift.
Yeah.
But I think if you don't have that kind of strategy and centralized approach, it's harder because you've got this group over here that discovers something cool and they start doing it and no one else knows about it and no one else benefits from it. And there's could be downsides too. So yeah, I think that sort of centralized approach seems to be working for a lot of organizations.
Cool. That actually it reminds me of the early days of DevOps, where you have a DevOps team that's doing certain things greenfield.
That's
But
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
what's old is new again.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, is there anything I haven't thought to ask you about you wanted to mention on this topic?
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, there's a lot going on. I think there's a lot people can and should be doing and will be doing. It is a moving target. So
Mm-hmm.
definitely a fun space to be.
Big time. Great. Well, again, thank you very much for joining me here. And it's always great to talk to you, Nancy.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 3, Observability in the Age of AI. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions, comments, or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at beth.pariseau, that's PARISEAU, at informatechtarget.com. Please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice, and tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about how observability is shaping AI and how AI is shaping observability.